The welfare state. In James's original book, The Welfare State We're In, James Bartholomew controversially argued that the British welfare state has done more harm than good. And I think many people responded by saying, well, if that's the case, what should we do about it? And in The Welfare of Nations, James seeks to answer that question, having travelled to 11 countries around the world, visited Australia, the United States, and see what has happened elsewhere and what models we might follow or learn from. He argues that welfare statism, which he describes as the new defining form of government of our age, has swept across the advanced world. Without any obvious dramatic revolution or any great theory behind it, welfare states are changing the nature of modern civilization. But in what ways and what lessons can it be learned before it's too late? Those are the questions that James poses and I think answers spectacularly well in this new book, The Welfare of Nations, which is available today and only today for the discount price of £15, which you can buy in the room opposite after the event. We have a star-studded panel this evening to consider welfareism more generally, but particularly the Bartholomew critique and suggestions. On my immediate right is Fraser Nelson, the editor of The Spectator, also a regular columnist for the Daily Telegraph, a frequent commentator on radio and television, and a member of the advisory board of the Centre for Policy Studies. Probably one of the most influential journalists in the Westminster Village, and in fact acknowledged as such by the Evening Standard a couple of years ago, naming him as one of the most influential journalists working in London. Fraser will speak first. We will then hear from Lord Freud, who was appointed as the Shadow Minister for Welfare Reform in February 2009 and became the Minister in May 2010 when the Conservatives came to office. And he's previously advised the government in this area. And I think it was in March 2007 that he published an independent report entitled Reducing Dependency, Increasing Opportunity, Options for the Future of Welfare to Work. And it's certainly been an area of government policy. The IEA is, of course, neutral of all political parties, where I think we've been most impressed by the government's reforms over recent years that seem to be having a truly, genuinely impact. And last, but of course, by no means least at all, the author himself, James Bartholomew, a journalist and author whose politics were crystallised when he was living in Hong Kong by seeing the dramatic advances in wealth for the people achieved by free market capitalism. And then I'm told further crystallised when this was followed by a train journey back to Britain through the poverty and political oppression of communist China and egalitarian countries such as the USSR and Romania that James also visited. After that, perhaps, the welfare state of Britain seemed innocent enough. But he came to see it as a cause of various kinds of decline and degradation. And his controversial book, The Welfare State We're In, was at the forefront of a revised view of the dangers of welfare states, has been read widely in government circles, has actually been a real blockbuster in free market policy making over recent years. And it's this new book in which he has recently travelled around the world looking at ways to keep some of the benefits that people want from welfare states with considerably less of the damage. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panel this evening. I'm going to ask each of our panellists to speak for 5 minutes or so. We'll then have the chance to take some questions for discussion, and hopefully that for those of you and those of they who can stay around, we can have some more informal discussion over a glass of wine afterwards. Fraser, can I ask you to take the stage first?
Thank you. It's a great honour to be asked here tonight. In journalism you get to meet a lot of famous people, but very few people you actually regard as heroes. And James has been one of mine for quite some time. The welfare argument that we're now so familiar with, it's difficult to remember that back when his book came out in 2004, there wasn't much of a welfare debate. Tony Blair had played with trying to copy the Clinton welfare reform. He'd asked Frank Field to think the unthinkable and then sacked him when he did it. But ever since then, there wasn't much going on ideologically. And to prove it, the Conservatives had Philip Hammond running welfare policy for them. No new ideas there at all. The right tended to see it as poor people as being the domain of the left, and journalists tended to see it as being something which is quite boring. I mean, DWP reforms, how interesting are they? How interested will your readers be in there? And it was at the time, I remember that it was the welfare state we're in, his first book, had this picture of this hoodie, wasn't it, James? And on it. This was the time before hoodies started stocking the Blue Water Centre in Kent, and the papers got very upset about it. And that was the real moment that we began to realise that yes, the welfare state has been going wrong, but the problems are now beginning to knock. When they come knocking on the door of the Blue Water Centre, then it's time for the Daily Mail to take notice, and everybody else did too. And then the welfare debate began to start in Britain. But in America, of course, they've got all these wonderful think tanks. People like Charles Murray who are able to devote so many years of service into it. Hugely well-resourced academics and studies into what was going wrong there. The Clinton experiment was possible because of an intellectual environment that had come before him. The Welfare Reform Act, which he signed, was the result of 5 or 6 years' worth of American argument about that. They just hadn't happened in Britain. It needed a spark to make it happen in Britain, and James's book provided that spark. It was a revelation to me. I was hugely interested in it. And then when the policy began to take shape, it was a work of constant referral. If you want to know what's happening here, why we're doing this, fundamentally, this isn't about saving money, it's about saving lives. And that's what James's book brilliantly brought out. Now, at the moment, welfare reform has been the toughest thing this government has had to do. The welfare cap has been the toughest thing the government's had to do. It's also the most wildly popular thing the government has implemented. So both left and right can see a paradox that what was once seen as the third rail of policy, the thing you don't touch because there's too much political pain, because people will come and chain themselves to the railings of Parliament if you try. It is now seen as being something that people are crying out for, especially those who live in the estates, where they can see the effects of bad welfare state everywhere. Now, Labour and the Tories are now united in trying to reform this. The Conservatives have taken the intellectual lead. This didn't always happen. It was Labour, of course, who got David Freud involved, and that when he went on to advise the Conservatives, it was a sign of who was taking the intellectual lead. But now, we could be 4 weeks away from a Labour government. Terrible thought. But if we do, then there's one thing that they will not change their mind on, that is welfare reform. The need for it is absolutely established and imperative. Rachel Reeves hasn't quite found the right language. She was saying the other day how she doesn't want Labour to be seen as the party that works for people on welfare. And it's a funny thing to say. She was trying to sort of sound tough, but you think to yourself, why not? Because James's books are about the people who are caught in bad welfare states. They are the victims. They are the people that government needs to represent, the government needs to work for, to try to help them get from where they are to where they want to be. And given that the consensus on the problem is now established, in a way it wasn't when James's first book came out, the solution is now up for discussion. And of course, as the rest of the Western world is grappling with this, the huge expense, there's a fiscal imperative to welfare reform. Even if you wanted to ignore it, you couldn't, because the costs are so high. And James goes right around the world, in country after country, showing what works and what doesn't. Why Switzerland's got very little minimum wage, why is there so little unemployment there? He goes to Singapore, find out what goes right and what's wrong, why there's so many sick people in Sweden connected to their sickness benefits. In country after country, he takes you on a tour of what works and what doesn't. And we're going to have to become, no matter who wins the election, even more innovative when it comes to working out how we're going to solve this. What is seen as radicalism yesterday will be commonplace tomorrow, because we've got to deal with this deficit somehow, and there isn't an option not to do it, and not reforming welfare isn't an option either. So I'm delighted that the man who blew open this debate, first of all, is the man who's come up with a guide for the next 5 years. This is the most important topic in Britain, and this is the most important book written about that topic. So I'm delighted he's done it, and I would like to pass over now to probably the most important minister when it comes to reforming it, David Freud. Thank you.
Thanks, Fraser. I feel I'm slightly here on false pretenses. I got the book last night and religiously read it, but I also did the quiz, which is at the beginning of the book. I don't know how many of you have done it. There are 22 answers you're meant to be able to get right, and I'm meant to understand this stuff, and I embarrassingly only got 11 out of the 22, so I clearly need to brush up my knowledge. I have to also confess, I mean, this was a quiz about welfare, the welfare states around the world. I have to confess that even when it comes to just one welfare system, I mean the welfare system, not the wider system, I don't actually understand it all. It's just too complicated, it's too big. I say that with some lack of embarrassment, because I know no one else can make the claim that they understand it. I don't even think our department, the DWP, understands it. It's too big. 220 billion pounds of spending every year is a lot of money, and every 50 million has got some nook and cranny and peculiar feature that it takes a long time to understand how they interrelate. And that is why this is quite such a bravura performance, James, that you not only look at the whole of the welfare system, you know, including the education issues, the old age issues, the health issues, but you do it for all these countries around the world. So it's a tour de force of coverage. The last time I sat down with James is a few weeks ago, and he asked me about, he was doing an article for Prospect, and he asked me how had we achieved these changes. I mean, I am so used to explaining, actually, we've done some good things, and they are beginning to show great results. So we've got our employment rate at 72.3%. And James says, yeah, get on with it. And then I went on, and don't forget, you know, at the same time, America, which we used to have exactly the same rates of employment, has now slipped, so we're 5 percentage points ahead of them. So we're doing something very different. Get on with it, says James. Because James has already bought the argument that we have achieved something. He wanted to know how. Now, I'm not used to answering that question, even though I've been working on it now for the last, actually, 8 years, trying to rebuild the system. And I didn't actually produce a very good explanation for him, much to his disgust. But I'm going to try now just to try and explain what we have changed and why, and then pick up as many of his recommendations in the book as I can to show how we have actually, even though we did it before he wrote the book, applied all his thoughts. I think there's a real political dividing line in welfare, and it isn't, I'm using a small p in political terms. I think it's between two approaches. The first approach is where you think someone's down on their luck, they've hit a tragedy, let's help them. Let's give them money. Let's help them. That's one group. And then there's the other approach, which says someone's down on their luck, right, let's get them in a position to pull themselves back, put them in a position to take responsibility for their own lives, which is actually what is the driving force of the reforms that we've been doing. And we've been helped by the fact that we can unambiguously say, get a job, that's the solution. Whatever the problem is, get a job. Because we have now had enough academic work done to find out that actually having a job is really good for you and not having a job is really bad for you. So it's a very unambiguous message, which 10 years ago was much tougher to say than it is now. Now, the issue is not, that is your first message in your book, is take responsibility. And I think that is one thing that we have tried to change the system to do. The issue that people love to talk about unemployment, but the reality is, right now, for instance, there isn't hardly any. You need to have roughly 750,000 people on the unemployment rolls for the flows, for people to lose a job and take a new job. That's the kind of figure you want. Well, we're below 1 million. So the amount of real, hardcore, pure unemployment is really relatively small. What isn't small is the number of people who are inactive, who found a nice place in the benefit system where they are not expected to go to work, where they're not formally unemployed. And that is, and getting those people reactivated back into the economy, into the economic life of the country, is actually what the fundamental argument was in my own report in 2007. And the groups that you're looking at are the disabled. A lot of disabled, there's more than 2.5 million, and they are formally expected, if you're on the disability benefit system, you are not allowed to work, or you're not allowed to earn more than just over £100 a week, and then bang, you lose it. You just go straight off a cliff edge. So it's kind of, disability has been equated with incapacity to work. And one of the things that we've succeeded in doing in this last 5 years is actually, in a recession, you lose people from the market into disability. That's what you do. And in the last 2 recessions, we've lost 2% of the workforce in that way. And in this recession, America has lost 2% of the workforce in that way. And we have actually increased the numbers of disabled people in work, actually reduced the numbers by 100,000. Look at lone parents. We had a rule 7, 8 years ago, 5, 6 years ago, that you didn't have to work if you're a lone parent until your youngest child was 16, by which time you had lost all of the work skills that you were likely to be able to apply. So we pulled that rate down, starting under the last government, increasing under this to youngest at 5, and a big increase in the numbers of lone parents back at work. Social housing, terrible, terrible figures there, where you saw people in social housing at the worst point in the cycle. 49% of them were workless, 49%. But, and this is even worse, at the best point of the cycle, no more than 46% were ever the workless figure never went below that 46%, hardly moved. So they were impervious to the economic cycle. They were in a ghetto of their own. They were just not part of the economy. And we've begun to make big inroads into that. The figure now has collapsed to 41%. That's a big change. And things like taking the comfort factor out of being on benefits in social housing, things like the benefit cap, things like the spare room subsidy, has actually started to move people into the workforce. And also we've actually seen a lot more attention paid by the social housing groups that one of their social functions, because this is a question that James asked, what's the point? One of the points that they have at last begun to think about is, I have a social role of getting people into work and transforming their lives if I am a social landlord. Next issue that James talked about was active labour market policies. You've got to have those. And clearly we have strengthened the sanctions regime, which means if people are looking for work, they have to look for work. But also you need really good programs to do that. And we've introduced the work program, which I think is the largest payment by results program in this area anywhere in the world. It is contracted out on the James model. And what that does, the most important, it is about value for money. It is a better value for money by far program than we've had. It's had better results than anything we've had. But the reason you do it like that is because if you're paid by your results, you will individualize your service and make sure that people are looked after in the way that will get them to work, not just because there's a program where you tick these boxes and you've done your job. But other programs, like getting this apprenticeship rate back up, doubled now to 2 million. Work experience really, really works and is cheap. The sector-based work academies really work. Those programs really are working and helping youngsters back into the market, introducing them to the market. James is very worried about means testing. He says that's the dangerous area. And he's right to be that. And that is one of the most intractable issues. We've introduced a completely new structure of benefit to get round that. That's the universal credit, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And the real structure of that, it's always worth working. Bit of flexible work, short-time work, part-time work, it's worth doing, which it is not doing in the ghettoized, carbuncleized system that we have. And not only that, you can understand what's going to happen to you. In the present system, you just don't know what's going to happen because it's slightly random, it's too complicated, no one can really understand all the implications. You don't do anything in those circumstances. You get a nice package and hold on to it, or a good enough package and hold on to it. Universal credit, very straightforward. If you work, you'll have more money in your pocket. And that gets rid clearly of the benefit trap. And it also provides an architecture that many of subsequent reforms can then work on, and you can build on, because you actually have control of the whole of the welfare apparatus, which you don't have until you introduce it. I can't resist picking up one other issue that James touched on, which is he's scathing about public sector IT. I have a lot of experience of public sector IT now. And universal credit is now going, we're rolling it out across the country. It's going well. People are 13% more likely to go into work when they're on universal credit than when they're on the equivalent JSA. And we've actually managed to roll it out in a way that where the budget has come down from 2.4 million to 1.8 million, the projected budget. And there are two lessons I have for him on how to do it. And the first is we've adopted this strategy of what we call test and learn, which means that you do things incrementally and grow them and wait for the responses, and don't go in huge scale until you really have bottomed out your issues. And the second issue is having a user specifier at the kind of the political level, which is a role that I have performed in this case with Ian, consistent and coherent all the way through, which is sometimes doesn't happen with big things. The idea that you can, politicians can say what they want and pass it over to a civil service who will then produce it is just not how the real world works if you want to produce anything. And those are my two lessons for James. So congratulations to him. It's an invaluable book. I think it will drive the debate to bring our society into better balance, into a healthier place. And there are a hell of a lot of issues that I don't know about, can't talk about, but you pull in issues around marriage, social housing, equality, all those. But I think there's a base there now for us to have that discussion and to do something about it when we decide what the right way to go is. James, well done.
James.
Well, 4 years ago I started work on this book, and I did a lot of research and travelled around the world, as Fraser said, and then I started writing it, and it wasn't going well at all. And I rang up my publisher, and the personnel of the publishers has changed somewhat. He was called Sam, the man at the time, and I said, Sam, this is not going well. I don't know how to write this book. If it's all just about facts, it's boring. Can I introduce myself? Can I make myself sort of part of a story? And he said, yes, do that, because otherwise it's going to be impossible, very dull to read. So I did that, but even then I thought, am I intruding too much? Is it boring? Am I trying to do too many things at the same time, trying to sort of give answers, depict the world that's changing, depict all these different ideas and aspects of the world? Is it not really working? And so if you can imagine, spending 4 years of your life not really sure whether it's going to work out, you can imagine the relief I felt when Fraser agreed to read the draft and agreed to make a favourable comment and said he was sorry he was being slow, he was loving the draft. I do not work on this book on the assumption it's going to work, and it's a really huge relief that someone of Fraser's importance and discernment should have approved it. And then I want to refer to, Fraser also, I should mention, has been one of the people who's prepared to sacrifice readership in order to address important issues. And that is so valuable because he's understood what's important in our society, and that the welfare state in all its aspects is terribly important in our lives. It's not just the fancy personalities of politics. This is the lives of millions of people that really matter. And I want to mention Lloyd Freud. I used to know him. We knew each other in the late 1970s when we both worked for the FT. And my impression of him at that time was of a sort of, he was very charming and nice, but he was sort of sceptical, sort of fairly sort of, you wouldn't have cast him as an idealistic guy. Then he went on, we lost touch, and he became incredibly successful in finance, made a fortune, and then he became a lord. Somebody said, when a contemporary of mine is really successful, a little bit of me dies. And it was a bit like that for me. Well done, David, well done. I thought from afar. But then, he's buckled down and he's gone on working in the background. Well, Ian Duncan Smith has been up there and other politicians, but he's been quietly there in the background, actually doing a lot of the real work on this. And as you've heard, mastering an awful lot of detail. This is hard work. And he could have been still going on earning pots of money in the city, but no, he's been doing this, and he's been doing it to doing good. And actually he's changing the lives, and has been changing the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, if not more than 1 million. The reduction of unemployment since 2010 is the biggest drop in unemployment that has ever taken place in this country without a boom, without above-trend growth. The biggest drop. It is an unprecedented event in my life and all our lives. And he is a large part of making that happen. And so while I've sort of gone around talking, he's been doing, and I take my hat off to him for that achievement. While I'm thanking people, and I'm thanking him for coming here too, because it's terrific that they're both here, I must thank Mark for hosting the event and being generally supportive. And in fact, it was in here, in these very rooms, just where you were having drinks before, that was part of the stimulation for writing this book in the first place. I was at an event here, and afterwards, John Blundell, who was then the Director General, took me to a reception that was taking place, and to my astonishment, I suddenly found myself being introduced to Lady Thatcher. And she was, Blundell marched me up to her and said, right, okay, James, tell her about your book. And so I told her, I was arguing that the welfare state had done more harm than good, and she said, oh yeah, so what are we going to do about it? I said, I gave a sort of flim-flam answer that I've always given, namely that I don't think a democracy is going to accept a really good answer, and I don't want to spend my time recommending a second best answer, so I might as well just give up, and the civilization's doomed. She said, no, that's not good enough. No, you must give an answer. She was buttonholing me. You must give an answer. You can't say there's a problem and then say nothing about what to do about it. And she wasn't the first person to suggest that I should suggest an answer, but she was the most insistent. So I must also thank some other people here, because Alan Gibbs is here, who helped fund the production values of this book. It's got better paper than normal. It's got lots of photographs. You need a photographic researcher. It's also got an index, a good index. And all this costs money, and he helped fund it. So part of the reason it's a good product, if it is because of his funding. Also, George Curry is here. Now, George, where are you, George? George, there you are. He's at the back there, skulking. George has been a regular visitor to my house and has helped me and encouraged me. The main thing he's done is just keep me cheerful and introduce me to a lot more to people like Bastiat that I wouldn't really have known about than I would otherwise have known. And Bastiat is quoted, and if you don't know Bastiat, you need to be introduced to him, because some of the best 2 or 3 pages in the English language, although they were originally written in French, are by Frederick Bastiat. It is magnificent prose. If he was a journalist today, he would be the top-paid columnist. And then, is Andrea Marcasetti here? Are you here? Yes, Andrea. Andrea is working for the Italian embassy. But if anybody needs somebody who's totally brilliant to work in a think tank, they should go and get him straight away. He did some research for me, and it was outstanding. And I should thank the publishers. bite back. I was told by my agent, no mainstream publisher is going to publish this. It's right wing, it's serious, it's about the welfare state. Forget it. But bite back, and Ian Dale in particular, stood behind it and were prepared to do it, even though it's not exactly going to be their biggest money-making venture. Although who knows? Let's live in hope. Going back to the research, I had a fantastic time. I mean, I travelled around the world and had all sorts of experiences, literally going from New Zealand to California, all the wrong way round, as it were, the long way round. This took a lot of money, and my friend Jeremy Hosking here was absolutely vital at the very beginning, and he committed to giving me monthly allowance to help me through it, to pay for all those hotel bills, all those aeroplane flights. This book cost a fortune. This is the most value for money book you will ever buy. Because it's been subsidised by Jeremy and Alan, and indeed myself. We have sacrificed a lot to produce something which is actually ridiculously ambitious. To cover the world of welfare states in one book by one guy, helped by various people, but it was ridiculously ambitious. And I'm just so relieved I finished it, because when I was going through it, I thought, will I ever finish this book? I'll just tell you one story. I mean, there's lots of stories from my experiences, but I'll just tell you one, which was a sort of sobering one. I was in Washington. I was talking to somebody about pensions and how to structure pension plans, because this book doesn't just cover welfare benefits, it covers every possible aspect of welfare, including lone parenting, care for the elderly. So it covers a lot of stuff. And I visited a person about pensions, a very civilized person, building near the Senate, very grand halls, security. And afterwards, I walked up to the Senate, which is a really impressive building, it exudes power and order and good organization. And afterwards, I thought, well, shall I take a taxi back to the hotel? And I thought, I'll just have a walk and relax. And I walked along away from the Senate. And after about 500 yards on a side street, I came across a group of people who were just sort of sitting around at the edge of the street, some on one side, some on the other, in ones and twos. They looked kind of sad and depressed. And I was trying to work out what they were doing here. Most of them were black, incidentally. And I looked on the side of the building. It said something about the housing or the homeless or something like that. And I wanted, the journalist in me wanted to go up to them and ask them, what are you doing here? What's it all about? And I also wanted to take a photograph, to use it for the book. And I thought, this is just too intrusive. These are people who are really sad, despondent, and they're not even in groups. They're sort of isolated. And I just wrote in my notebooks of lonely sadness or something like that. Just seeing these people and perceiving their unhappiness brought home to me that this is not a game we're playing. These are lives. These are human beings who get miserable and who are unemployed, who feel their lives are worthless. And there's no scope here for people to have barroom views and say, oh, they're all scroungers, or to say, oh, they're all give them all the money they want, or you've got to take this seriously. These are complex, difficult issues. As David has reflected in what he said, every issue is difficult and complex, and it's so easy to get it wrong, and it's so difficult to understand it all. So we must be really serious about these issues and not just go for the soundbite. This is, at the moment, what we're seeing what I regard as a fantasy election. It's a fantasy because the issues are discussed are things like some Labour MP saying, isn't it outrageous? The NHS is in danger. It's going to be destroyed. We've had the private contracting go up from 4% to 6%. It's the end of the world. All that we hold dear is now in danger. And that's nonsense. It's just so petty. What we should be discussing is, should we go to a Singaporean health insurance system with private health insurers? Or should we go to a Singaporean system with health savings accounts? These are what we should be discussing. The NHS is clearly a lousy system which results in the deaths of thousands of people every year. There's no way serious people should be debating whether it's 4% or 6%. Whether it's a system is worth keeping on to at all. And the answer is no, it's not. And in education, we shouldn't be complacent about where we are in education. This should be a major issue. Out of British schools, 16%, more than 16%, come out of school at 15, or at 15 when they're tested, they are functionally illiterate. This is no place for complacency. But why isn't education a major issue? Why isn't mass illiteracy an issue in this election? It's not. Our pensions, we work under the pretense that our pensions are sustainable. They're not sustainable. They're a nonsense. They're a lie. They're not funded, and the population is aging. Either the amounts will be reduced, or the age at which you get them will be raised. The people should not rely on pensions. I mean, we're pretty bad here in France. They really, it's a fraud upon the people. So it's the same in Italy. What I saw, though, as I went around the world, was that people like to think in Britain that we're the only welfare state. This is absolute tosh. There's no country, advanced country in the world that does not have a welfare state. I mean, if somebody can name one to me, I'd be interested. But America has a massive welfare state. State education. 1 in 7 Americans are on food stamps. They're in a much worse position than we are now, as David reflected. So it's worldwide. I went to a social housing place in France. I was guided by a taxi driver. He would not go into some of these estates. They were too dangerous. We drove in through one. There was a torched car on the side. They burn cars for fun in the estates in Marseille. And they have Kalashnikovs. And there's a known price. They're in the local papers. Anyway, the point is this. The whole world is being taken over by welfare states. And even those countries which are not advanced at the moment, they will develop them. China will develop them. Russia will develop them. All these countries, as they economically develop, will develop welfare states. It is therefore of primary importance that people around the world think, what is the best way to design a welfare state? What are the models that work best? What are the least bad things to do? We need to think about it. We need to make the right decisions because people's lives are at stake. And the book is an attempt to work out the least bad ways of running a welfare state.